It's always a pleasure to have Elizabeth Kostova with us. She's going to be doing the honors for introductions this evening and tell you a little bit more about UNC Press. And we're always delighted to see her. Elizabeth Kostova is a novelist and educator living here in Asheville. Her books include The Shadowland, The Swan Thieves, and The Historian. Kostova's work has been translated into 40 languages. She is also co-founder of the Elizabeth Kostova Foundation for Creative Writing in Bulgaria. And we are so happy to see you this evening. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much. It's always such a pleasure to be at Malaprops, and I'm very excited to welcome our author this evening, which I'll do in a minute. But I also want to say a couple words about the UNC Press, which published this fascinating book we're going to hear all about this evening. We are very proud of the books published by the press. The press is, I think it's a state gem. It's going into its second century, which is incredible as of last year. So congratulations to our author for helping launch this next century. Very timely book. And it is an incredibly productive press. The press publishes a book about every 3 days. About 125 books a year. And these are very high quality books. About half of them win awards, including the Pulitzer Prize in History, Bancroft Prize, National Book Awards. They're really extraordinary books. And they also, I think a lot of people don't necessarily know this about University Press, but our University Press in North Carolina publishes a real range of books. So some of them are scholarly or textbooks. A lot of them are academic studies. A lot of them are general interest nonfiction, including the stories of flora and fauna and food culture, just about everything you can think of that touches our region. And the book we have this evening is both scholarly and extremely readable. Not that those two shouldn't go together, they really do in this book. So I think the press is one of the undiscovered treasures of North Carolina and of the Southeast. So I hope you'll explore our catalog. We are very proud to present this book. It is incredibly timely. There it is. Resistance from the Right, Conservatives and the Campus Wars in Modern America. And tragically, this is today a really timely book. As I think everyone here knows by now, there was a really terrible shooting at the University of North Carolina campus yesterday. It happened a few blocks from the press, and it did not seem to be politically motivated, but it's clear that our campuses are in turmoil still. And so I'm really glad we're presenting this today, and thank you, Lauren, for writing it. I want to introduce our author. I just got to talk with her a little bit. She is checking in with us from South Mississippi. It's amazing, the power of technology. Thank you for doing this tonight, Lauren. And as always, thank you again to Malaprops for partnering with us. And thank you for being here, all of our virtual audience. Lauren Lassabe Shepherd, whom you're about to meet, is a historian of education, and her expertise is in the history of U.S. higher education from the 20th century to the present, especially on the topic of conservatism in the academy. She currently teaches in the Department of Education and Human Development at the University of New Orleans. And I hope you'll tell us a little bit about what it's like to teach in this field as well. Her second book is a historical survey of American colleges and universities since the 1960s. And reading her first book, Resistance from the Right, I thought, unbelievable amount of research, Lauren, but I can only imagine what the second book is going to be or is in terms of research. And I hope you'll share a little of that with us too. Lauren enjoys teaching Pilates and practicing yoga, and she and her husband live with their 5 dogs, wow, in South Mississippi. So welcome, Lauren. And I also want to introduce Malaprop's own Patricia Furnish, who is interviewer par excellence and is going to be interviewing Lauren now. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Lauren, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you on this virtual event. Just to get things started, I am a bookseller at Malaprops. My PhD is in Native American history, 20th century, and I study the first indigenous activist group of the 20th century, the Society of American Indians. So I'm very interested in political activism among particular groups. And so your book is not only contributing, I would say, to that larger historiography of movements, but it seems to my mind that you're also challenging some assumptions and some neglect that the right on campuses in the 1960s experienced. So just to start things off, what brought you to this topic that ultimately became resistance from the right?
So what is now the book was first my dissertation. And I consider them two different beasts because they look completely different now, thinking back on the process, but the book did come out of the dissertation. So I guess that is where this began. As a student, idea for this came out of a history of higher education course. We were on our unit learning about the 60s and a lot of campus activism. And this was 2016. So we were at the height of the election. And I remember thinking, wasn't Donald Trump a college student in 1968, like in the late 1960s? Where was he in the campus wars? And it turns out he was just evading the draft a handful of times, which was not unusual for someone of his class and connections socially and his financial background. But it kind of got me thinking, like, well, I'm reading all of this about, very left-wing progressive activism, especially when it came to the anti-war movement on campus or demands for Black studies programs or increased diversification of the faculty and the student body. And so I just wondered, I know outside of higher ed in K-12, there's this massive resistance. What does that look like on the campus? And I couldn't really find an answer. In all of my research, I kept coming back to one organization, and that was Young Americans for Freedom, or YAF. And YAF is still around today. I'm sure we'll talk a lot about them tonight. I spend a lot of time on them in the book. But they seem to be the only student group. And the more I kept digging deeper into the archives, the more I was interviewing people. My dissertation was part ethnography. I came to learn that there are all these other groups. And then I got thinking, well, why don't I know about them? Why aren't we talking about them? Come to find out, I actually was fooled by that. It turns out there really weren't that many groups. There were maybe 2 or 3 big organizations, and we'll get into some of those details. But a lot of them were front groups created by Young Americans for Freedom to make their presence on campus seem more influential than it actually was. They were positing themselves as a youth silent majority. Of course, this is the late 1960s, so they're hearkening to Nixon's silent majority. But yeah, so I just kept uncovering more and more fascinating things. And as Elizabeth very kindly said in the introduction, the book has been very timely. But when I was writing about this in 2016, this was really just my own personal exploration. This was some niche topic to me that I didn't see in the existing literature, and that I said, okay, this is the gap I'll fill for my dissertation. And then, of course, I graduated in 2020, defended my dissertation, in 2020. And then we started seeing all of this stuff in the news, especially attacks against K-12, talk of cancel culture and critical race theory and wokeism. And so far in the last few years, that's really been targeted at K-12, but I think we've seen in the last few months, especially in several cases in Texas and in Georgia and Florida, And most recently, West Virginia, these attacks are coming for higher education as well. And so, yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the book is timely, and hopefully readers can find something in the past that they see reflected today, and they can understand the longer context of what's happening.
One of the timely elements of your book is how it coincides with the book called A Conspiratorial Life about Robert Welch.
Yes.
And the founding of the John Birch Society. And so I think it is, if people are really trying to get a more fulsome understanding of the nuances of conservatism and conservative movements of all kinds, because I think you present in your book, it's not a monolith. I mean, you're right, there are all of these front groups, but the consensus, there was some consensus, perhaps around anti-communism, for example, but there was kind of a strain of the intellectual conservative, William F. Buckley Jr., for example, and then the more rough and coarse and deeply offensive kind of conservatism that was sometimes really present. When you think about what your book brings to the layperson's understanding of these conservative movements, what do you think the misconceptions might be, especially in a time that's so heavily charged? People may think they're just coming to a book to only understand now, but you're also trying to explain the past. What are those misconceptions?
Well, so if I can almost answer a different related question, I think the bigger misconception is, especially when people look to higher education in the 60s, they really think of the new left and they don't think of the right at all. So not only am I trying to define the differences among these groups and maybe even some antagonisms they had with each other before ultimately working together. I think the most important thing to know is that there was a version of like massive resistance in higher education, and it didn't just come from parents, it came directly from the students themselves. And as I argue in the book, the students, the word I use is they're foot soldiers of the larger post-war conservative movement. So you mentioned William F. Buckley a second ago. Buckley was his family home, his family estate was the location for the founding of Young Americans for Freedom. He was like a mentor to this group. He was always on its board. And I mean, he was involved with recruiting the initial members. So that was Buckley's hand in Young Americans for Freedom and YAF, which is the more, the way you described a second ago, more kind of boisterous, like bombastic, firebrand of conservative youth. Buckley is always a presence with them for sure, but he also has his hands in intellectual societies. So there's a campus-based group, one that he himself founded at Yale as a student in 1953, called the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. At ISI, it's still around today, but it was created in the 50s as a foil to the Intercollegiate Socialist Society. So I'm sure viewers might be familiar with Buckley's first book, in which he talks about the university as a place for paganism and, well, not paganism, but as a place that is hostile to Christianity, and is just full of socialist mischief and indoctrination. So Buckley's big arguments there is we don't need to destroy the campus. We need to revolutionize the campus so that this indoctrination benefits our side. It benefits conservatism. And that's an interesting thing that we don't really see today. So a lot of the attacks on higher education in 2023 are really about taking the university apart. I mean, there's so many crises going on right now. Adjunctification is huge, and I can talk all day about that if you like. But defunding higher education or just taking apart humanities departments and removing tenure from faculty. None of those things did we see in the 60s? I mean, the animosity towards the university is there for sure. But what these conservative students are more concerned about doing is preserving what already exists, or maybe even bringing it back to some pre-existing time where they feel like they were the most important group, the most valued group, where the curriculum, they were still very appreciative of the humanities and liberal arts. That's another big difference. They wanted the curriculum to look like a traditional Western civilization, lots of focus on the classics, on Latin and Greek and classical studies, and teaching from like a great books curriculum. Today, you would not hear any leader in the GOP who is in charge of education or is speaking on education promote any of that. They're so focused on things that won't play a large role in the university, like critical race theory and other things that they put under this banner of this very scary banner of wokeism. They'd rather dismantle these things. And so that's been a big difference, past and present. So that's one big change. And then, like I mentioned a second ago, the big correction is actually there was a conservative student presence in the 60s, and they had outsized power, and they really have left a legacy the last 60 years, not just on the institution, but on the GOP itself. There's another argument that I make in the book, that many of these students go on to become college administrators themselves. They go on to become faculty themselves. They're on boards of trustees. They become lawyers or politicians in some other way, shape policy of higher education, or they're big donors to their alma maters. And some of them become the vice president of the United States, like Dan Quayle. He was a member of YAF. Bill Barr, who was the attorney general under the second Bush administration and also the Trump administration. There are the 5 dogs. They wanted to join in.
The dogs, the pets love Zoom. What can we say? It's okay. It's all right. I'll give you a moment if you'd like me to.
No, that's okay. I think they're calmed down now. Spoke too soon.
That's all
anyway,
right.
So there are.
That's okay. You can keep going. It's all right. And plus, don't worry. I can edit anything. It's okay. So okay. Cameras are rolling. Don't you worry. The show's going on.
Let's see. Dan Quayle, he's a YAF alumni. Also William Barr, Jeff Sessions, David Duke, Pat Buchanan. I mean, these are people who've run for president before unsuccessfully, but who have in other ways shaped higher education policy. Newt Gingrich, how could I forget Newt Gingrich? These are all men that appear as 18, 19, 20-year-olds in the book. And, they've spent their life in conservative causes and in the GOP, and frankly, shaping the course of public education in the United States for 60 years.
And I'm so glad that you mentioned this range of this cast of characters, because certainly they come out of a kind of anti-New Deal movement that a lot of people may not really understand was very strong in the United States. And then also, of course, House Un-American Activities Committee was opened under Roosevelt. So there are these threads that you pick up, and of course in the Cold War and the anti-communism of the late 40s, early 50s, 60s, 70s, really those of us who remember that in the 80s under Reagan. So when you're positioning your book, what other books do you see you're almost in a conversation with? Are there some books that you think, okay, I really see where I might be talking with or adding more to, or maybe they actually, the reverse, they need to be in conversation with you?
So the project really was interdisciplinary. When I was working on this as a dissertation, some books that I really turned to, they're now over 20 years old, so it's not quite current literature, but if I could turn to the shelf behind.
Please do. It's a little show and tell. Take us on a tour.
Okay, so here are some sources for readers. Actually, this is probably very beneficial for anyone who's interested in learning more specifically about YAF, because YAF is who has been written about, whereas some of the other groups I talk about, like ISI and even college Republicans, don't have dedicated monographs from academic historians. They do have their own internal histories, and you can read them, but I'm not sure that they're so reliable. So anyway, here are the books. A Generation Awakes. This is by Wayne Thorburn. Thorburn may still be the president of the of the Texas GOP. I'm not sure. He has had academic positions in the past. I think that he was at UT, but anyway, this is his history of YAF. It is it exists. Let's see. He also has a second edition, which is much smaller. This, I think, is published by YAF's own press, or it may even be published. A lot of times these books are published internally by like conservative presses, like Henry Regnery is one, and ISI's press is another. For fascinating look at 1968 events at Columbia, there is a book called A Time to Stir. This is very good for anyone who's interested in the campus wars. Actually, you know what, rather than just taking y'all through my shelf, if there's anyone who is interested in like a full bibliography, I'd be glad to create something and share it. I could put it in a Google Doc and make it open to anybody who wants to see. But yeah, so
thank you.
Yeah, of course. So most of what I just referenced, these have to do with higher education, but I mean, the book I think also will have appeal to political historians, and just general educated readers, people who keep up with the news every day, or even just weekly, even who just take a cursory glance at the news. I think you'll find a lot of this relevant.
One of the topics that came to my mind in relation to your book was Richard Hofstadter's book, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life.
Yeah.
Because I think that there's a way in which maybe readers or the reading public may not be as familiar with the tug of war, the push and pull about what we can read, what we can consume, what is a mark of patriotism, loyalty, education, being, in air quotes, cultured. So I'd be curious to hear also your ideas about what explains the lack of rigorous research regarding the right that you are actually recovering and positing as this is important. We need to understand this. What's the reason for it being overlooked?
Well, so in academic spaces, maybe it is. I don't know. There's been a lot of recent interest, I think, on the right. I think in the 90s, there seemed to be like a plethora of books about the right. And then after, say, 9/11, that kind of went away. And I think it's been resurgent again. I know there's been some really good recent like political histories that specifically cover the right in the 90s. And the thing that comes to the top of my mind is Nicole Himmer's Partisans. It's a fantastic book that everybody should read. Also does a good deep dive into Newt Gingrich. Let's see. But I mean, I don't want to overstate my intervention. I mean, I am only writing about 3 years. I'm writing about 1967 to 1970. The conclusions, yes. I mean, you can certainly see a through line through today, but I mean, in academic circles, there are much more studies about the right, and for the longest time within conservative circles, they've never stopped tooting their own horn. They have been, I write in the book, they've been prolific on the subject of their own victories, and then in terms of like where they are in higher education, I guess they're overlooked or ignored in the 60s. A lot of people who've written about the 60s were former activists themselves. And so they are interested in covering Students for a Democratic Society, right? Like some of the white New Left groups, or some of the civil rights groups. Those people, those former activists are still around. So
and shaping their story as well. I mean,
yes.
that's a part there. That's something that activists on the left and the right are deeply invested in, is making sure that they're almost the caretakers of their
legacy,
and of their narratives, and who's giving the stamp of approval. I certainly see that with the former members of the Weather Underground and SDS. I would posit that for sure.
Yeah. So I mentioned that the dissertation was an ethnography. So I interviewed over 50 former activists, and I wasn't really sure. I did these interviews in 2018, 2019, and some right after COVID online or virtual, excuse me. But I wasn't sure how people would, if they would even want to talk to me, right? Because I'm asking, like, tell me what exactly you were doing as a college student in 1969 when you were standing outside of a women's residence hall that had a burning cross, a Black women's residence hall that had a burning cross in front of it. What were you doing there? Were you an observer? Were you a counter protester? Were you endorsing this? So I wasn't sure that anyone would even want to answer those types of questions. I was wrong, though. They were more than happy to share their stories with me. Again, this is all pre January 6th. Maybe some things have changed in that context, but yeah, I mean, in 2018, at the height of the Trump administration, they were very proud of their legacies. Even some people I interviewed multiple times, because they would reach back out to me and they would say, hey, I forgot to tell you something. I want you to know this too. Or they would even mail artifacts to me. That I had one participant emailed me multiple newspaper clippings to my faculty. Well, it wasn't my faculty office, but to the department office where I was a graduate student. And yeah, I mean, they were extremely concerned about their legacies. And I guess that makes sense now, because if you have a researcher reaching out to say, you know what, I'm going to write about you. You can tell me what you want me to know, or you can let me write your story myself. Now, I'm not going to share my story with you until it's published. You don't really get, let's say, an editing or overviewing or making any sort of corrections. But yeah, I mean, they put their best foot forward. There were certain things that they wanted, and I can almost see, because a lot of these former activists are still in connection with each other. I mean, they've spent the last 60 years in legacy groups like the Philadelphia Society is one, or they're just involved in conservative organizations since their time as college students. So a lot of them told me, not word for word, but basically the exact same stories. Like, I asked many of them in 1968, a lot of the Yaffers were not campaigning for Nixon. They were campaigning for Ronald Reagan, 1968. And so they would tell me stories that were almost like verbatim. And it's like, there's no way that you remember this so well. These people are in their 80s. These are stories that they have shared with each other over the years. And so that's why, I mean, I knew that's why there was so much correlation there. But it's interesting as the ethnographer to sort of watch these patterns or themes emerge. And yeah, of course, I have to balance everything they tell me with things that I see in the archive, and try to make good judgment on something that happened so long ago.
It is,
yeah, I mean,
it is very gratifying when people circle back and say, oh, wait, I just remembered something, or I wrote some things down, and then you get like 20 pages front and back handwritten, and you're like, oh, boy, okay, so you really did remember some things. You're very humble to say, I'm only covering 3 years, but they're 3 very important years. And they recover an understanding that I think is really important about Reagan and the ascent of Reagan, the changes that are going to come with Reagan and the conservative movement. but it also helped me kind of move into the past. And I was thinking of Robert Cohen's book, When the Old Left Was Young, about the old left of the 1930s. They were deeply dedicated members of the Communist Party in the United States, supporters of the Soviet Union, really believing that the Great Depression had revealed the problems of capitalism. And the book juxtaposes that old left with the emergent new left of the 1960s. So what do you see when you look at this conservatism on the right that emerges at the time period you're looking at, late 60s, on campuses throughout the country, and earlier conservative movements? Where do you see some origins, some contrasts?
I would actually really like to go backwards. My next project will be moving forwards, but it would be good to go back to the 20s and back to the 30s. And I don't know that there would have been such a boisterous college right. I mean, certainly there is a post-war right that emerges, and like you mentioned earlier, even anti-New Deal right that comes in response to the New Deal and the Depression. But I just don't know what that looks like on college campuses. But if I could speculate, one of the things that I anticipated I'd find in the research is that I would find many conservative activist groups in the South and in the Midwest. And I was so surprised to find that just wasn't the case. A lot of campuses in the South and Midwest were extremely quiet, and that's because they didn't have a strong new left presence. So in the sense that conservatism is reactionary, and it's not always, but in what, for my topic, what I was writing about is the reaction, the resistance from the right. You need a foil, you need a left. And if that left isn't there, then you're just asking in the status quo, which is what you'd be asking to return to anyway if there were some progressive challenge. So to answer your question about like the 20s and 30s, I just don't know. I mean, so Buckley is not only Buckley, there's another author too on the right, M. Stanton Evans, who will go on to work at the Indianapolis Star as an editor there and a writer and have a long career in journalism. He also was at Yale around the same time as Buckley and had similar complaints. So, I mean, maybe there was a really small presence, but I mean, that's at an extremely elite campus. It's in a New England setting. I don't know that you'd see something like that, say in Madison in the 20s or the 30s, or at a state institution. And that's not to imply that higher education was like super accessible to anyone the way that it might be more accessible to us today. You're still a very elite student if you go to a state campus. I want to be clear about that. I don't know. That's an interesting question. I don't have an answer. That is my speculation.
One of the things that you brought up was that, you're really talking about men. And what about the presence of women or people of color who might have been important, influential, overlooked in the conservative period you're looking at in the late 60s?
So glad you asked that. So I go over a lot of this in chapter 1. In chapter 1, there's a whole section about demographics. So just so everybody understands the landscape of higher education in general, this is not just conservative students. In 1969, 95% of colleges are 95% white. And in the South, you have very few Black students at all. I mean, HBCUs are still the norm. Women's colleges are still the norm, even in New England. So some organizations like YAF did have women members. They had women even in leadership positions, as state chairs, on mastheads, as editors of some of the right's underground papers. And we can talk about the underground papers if you like. So women were a presence. And when I interviewed a handful of them, they gave me differing answers. So I asked them about, did you feel like, being a woman put you at a disadvantage, or did you feel like you were treated differently as part of your group? And a lot of the times they said, no, absolutely not. This was not an issue. I was treated just like the guys. See, for example, my friend so-and-so, who was the state chair of Michigan. And so they could point to those examples. But then I had other women who said, oh gosh, yes, we would. This is an example from the book. She said they'd be sitting in a chapter meeting, and the president would never catch the eye of any of the women. He would just be talking to the men. But I should say that that's not something specific to conservatives, even among the new left. I mean, there's a whole body of literature that talks about the sexism on the left, right? Women, even in like the Black Panthers, for example, or in SDS, were often relegated to jobs like going to get coffee or being made to do secretarial work or small administrative tasks rather than being some like new left firebrand, say like Angela Davis. She would have been exceptional as far as college students go. So then about Black students, so GAF had at most 20,000 members. To say it had 50,000, but at most there were. I'm being generous with that. I think the number is actually probably more like 15,000. Of all of the archive I've sifted through, of all of the people that I've spoken with, they could only remember 3 Black students. One of them is Myrna Bain. She went on to be a professor of women and gender studies, I think, in the SUNY system. Maybe she was at NYU. And so she disavowed the right, but she did for a time write for the National Review, and she also founded a chapter. So this is a Black woman founding a chapter of Young Americans for Freedom at Hunter's College. So that's one. And there are 2 other men. Only one was involved in YAF, and the other was involved in ISI at Pepperdine. I mean, they're exceptional. I mean, you could practically say that there were no Black members, out of a population of 20,000 students.
What does the write of your book have in common with the left that it was opposed to? And that means in terms of tactics, rhetoric, ideology that has to do with, access to information, presence of women, presence of people of color. Where do they overlap? Sometimes I see politics more as a horseshoe rather than, just a flat line, and that somewhere they touch, or they're in the same area. And it's okay if you don't agree with me on that. That's okay. I'm just wondering if you saw any commonalities.
Yeah. So I also like the horseshoe theory. Sometimes that horseshoe becomes a circle. There are plenty of examples of people who moved, especially to the right. So people who at one point, especially in the 30s, were communists, self-identified communists, and then they become anti-communist. But anyways, yeah, so structurally, a lot of those things are the same. Just if you think about the nature of college students, if you're operating in the context of the 1960s, you're not, there's going to be sexism. That is the context of the historical moment. That can't be escaped. So of course, we're going to see that played out on both sides. But in terms of, you asked about their rhetoric or their tactic or their style. Another thing I spend a lot of time on in the book is, so the right at some point just says, you know what? Everything the left does, we should just mock. We should do exactly what they're doing, but sort of co-opt or not even adapt, because they weren't trying to be complementary. They were trying, the purpose was to undermine, to insult, to make like a funhouse mirror image of whatever the left was doing. So let's say the left had a slogan, the right would take it and co-opt it for its own purposes. Or we mentioned underground newspapers. The right had their own underground newspapers. When students were calling for, I'll find you, we talked about potentially reading an excerpt.
Yeah, it'd be great if I would love that if you have a little sample that you could read for us. It'd be great.
Yeah, that would answer that question. This is only coming to mind because someone recently picture of this on Blue Sky on the social media app and said, wow, this is something that could be happening today. So one of the calls that the New Left asked for, especially students in like the Campus Black Power movement, wanted Black studies programs. They wanted more faculty of color. They had a list of non-negotiable demands. And so one of the things that the right would often do is take those demands and just mock them by creating what they called a spoof. But really, like I mentioned earlier, the whole intent is to use satire to communicate disdain and to undermine and embarrass the anti-war and pro-civil rights peers. So if you'll indulge me, I'll read you one paragraph. This comes from page 68.
Please.
Just some examples. Creating spoof clubs with demeaning acronyms was a popular strategy. At Wichita State University, conservatives formed the Society for the Preservation of Asinine Student Movements. The acronym read SPASM. University of Southern California conservatives formed a World Association of Bayesian Students, whose acronym sounds like a slur for Italian Americans, which demanded an Italian studies program to celebrate Al Capone, the culturally sensitive cafeteria option of pizza, and a massive canal project to offer transportation on campus via gondola staffed with mandolin players. Their demands were to be met by April 22nd to honor the birthday of Italy's fascist dictator, Benito Mussolini. So we would see these sort of parody. I could go on. There's so many more examples in here, but we see the right create just like parodies of all of the things that the left was doing. Another thing that you see too, an example after the Kent State massacre in May of 1970, students nationwide go on strikes. There are protests, there are silent vigils. A couple of students on campus, I believe in Boston, but the details are written within the book. Students are going on hunger strike. So the right-wing campus group held a pizza party and ate, I guess, in front of the students who were holding the vigil and on the hunger strike. So I mean, those are just a couple of examples, and you usually see that done from groups like YAF. Remember, we called YAF the shock troops. There are other groups of conservative students, like the intellectual groups like ISI, who are not activists, who wouldn't have been involved in things like this, but who probably would have come up with some sort of high-minded or impressively sounding justification for whatever it was. And that was the function of a lot of conservative elders. So people who were not students themselves, but who perhaps mentored these students in their groups. They would help them with their wording when students were like, you know what, I have this impulse. I want to react on it, but I can't justify why it is I feel this way. They would have, mentors from either National Review or Modern Age or Human Events or some other larger magazine that would help them articulate their feelings a little bit better. And the best example I can think of, this is another Kent State example, across the nation, students had lowered their campus flagpoles to half-mast in mourning of the 4 victims who died at Kent State. And so one of the leaders of YAF, one of the members of its executive board, said, well, we don't really want to see this. So some of the YAF members had literally fought in tug of wars at the campus flagpole, like at the base of the flagpole, trying to raise the flag. And then other people were trying to keep it at half mast, and it would turn into brawls in several different situations. Or several different campuses, including at Tulane. Newt Gingrich was involved in one of these, and you can read about that in the book. But YAF's elders helped the students justify it in the aftermath by saying, you know what, this is an example of administrators politicizing the university. We shouldn't be lowering our flags to commemorate anyone for anything. This country's at war. We should all be patriotic. The students who were shot at Kent State were shot because they were protesting, and the National Guard was there and had already told them to go home, and they shouldn't have been there. They come up with all of these reasons why to put words in the mouth of the students who are just reacting and maybe don't have the intellectual chops to justify its feelings.
And of course, the Vietnam War is really the seminal defining conflict that galvanized a lot of student protest from the left and people who lost family in the war, and then men returning from war, and then through the GI Bill going to college or university for the first time in their lives. So the campus atmosphere and the presence of the military and the National Guard, the militarization of campuses, you've really got this cauldron in the time period you're looking at. So what was something that you had to leave out or trim down that you said, oh, I wish I could have put this as an appendix in there, or I'll put it on my website and reader judge?
Yes, I did talk about. Okay, so my fantastic editor at the University of North Carolina Press, Andrew Winters, had to tell me at one point to stop writing because I had gone over and we had already agreed, like, we've sent this out for peer review, we got positive notes, and I'm saying, well, what if we added 2 more chapters on this? And so he politely cut me off. I'm so glad he did. The book is so much better and concise because of it. But I had to leave a lot on the chopping block. And so one of those stories about Newt Gingrich at Tulane is one of them. And I hope I can publish. I mean, I could put it on my website, but maybe I'll try to get it out a little wider. There's so much. I'm trying to think of a good little anecdote for y'all. I know a good story if you'd let me read one more thing.
Of course.
So I opened the book with an instance of a conservative speaker on campus being shouted down. And I had some feedback from someone who actually did the early review of the book say it's fascinating because maybe it's something we could see happening today, but it's a segue into a different argument I'll make. So this is from the introduction. On an unseasonably cool May 3rd, 1967, thousands of young people gathered in Hanover, New Hampshire to hear George Wallace, the pro-segregation ex-governor of Alabama and candidate for president, deliver an address to the students and faculty of Dartmouth College. All 1,400 seats of Webster Hall were filled, with an additional 1,000 bystanders gathered outside of the hall, tuned into the campus radio broadcast. But the segregationist speech was inaudible over boos and shouts of Wallace, racist, by members of Students for a Democratic Society and the Afro-American Society. White audience members barked back, "Shut up," and voted the SDS and AAS to get out. As SDS and AAS members began a walkout, some of the most raucous members in the crowd outside broke past police barricades and entered the auditorium. Hecklers shouted, "Here comes the lynch mob," as students burst into the hall and stormed the center aisle. Alabama state troopers brought in as reinforcement whisked Wallace off stage to his getaway vehicle, which was immediately surrounded and assailed by rocks and pounding fists. The commotion was contrived on the speaker's part as much as the audience's. The students wanted a spectacle of dissent. Wallace wanted their spectacle of dissent as a talking point. "They're trying to turn the car over and blow in the top," said the victimized segregationist to a reporter at the Chronicle of Higher Education. "That's academic freedom. That academic freedom will get you killed." Wallace, a man who could strut sitting down, often welcomed hostile activists to his populist rallies. Allowing them to demonstrate first, he would follow with a clever announcement from the stage. "You young people seem to know a lot of 4-letter words, but I have 2 4-letter words you don't know: SOAP and WORK." To a Harvard professor, he once quipped, "If you can't distinguish at Harvard between honest dissent and overt acts of treason, then you ought to come down to Alabama. We'll teach you some law down there." While Wallace's Dartmouth visit was indisputably antagonistic, a minority of voices in the crowd shouted his defense in defiance of AAS and SDS protesters. These students arrived in earnest, eager to hear the presidential candidate, notorious for promising segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Shortly after the debacle, a Dartmouth faculty committee voted to suspend the anti-Wallace demonstrators for the remainder of the spring term. That a segregationist was invited to speak at an Ivy League college during the height of the Civil War movement was a curiosity, but it was not exceptional. Wallace's appearance at Dartmouth represents part of a longer story about conservative and right-wing backlash directed at higher education. The right's grumblings that the economy functioned as a breeding ground for anti-Americanism were articulated throughout the 1930s and 40s by anti-New Deal businessmen lamenting Keynesian economic solutions emanating from the ivory tower. These complaints were perhaps most popularly articulated in the 1950s by students who would become leaders of the post-war conservative movement, William F. Buckley Jr. and M. Stanton Evans. As Yale students, Bill Buckley and Stan Evans were themselves no stranger to the Ivy League. They were founding members of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. The organization was created in 1953 by writers at the Freeman and Human Events magazines and bankrolled by the William Volcker Fund as a foil to the Intercollegiate Socialist Society. With Buckley, the enfant terrible of the right as its first president, ISI functioned as an intellectual bulwark against perceived liberal indoctrination on American campuses 2 decades before Wallace's invitation to Dartmouth. So I opened that story with sort of like a situation that you wouldn't expect. Dartmouth, an Ivy League. Why is Dartmouth entertaining George Wallace? Why is he there on campus to speak? And so I'll give you another example too of that story when we were talking about earlier differences in past and present. Conservative speakers claim that they're shouted down on campus all the time, or that they're banned, or that they're not allowed. But what I found when I was interviewing former activists on the right in the 60s is that they were always willing to hear leftist speakers on campus, and they said that's because they wanted to hear the bad ideas. They wanted to let the bad ideas out into the air so that they could defeat them with their better arguments. And again, today, that's just not something that you would hear from the right. The right is much more interested in silencing and persecuting their enemies, their intellectual or political enemies, than they are in hearing them out. So
You reminded me of the presence of the former president of Iran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, at Columbia University during the height of the war in Iraq. So this is the former president of Iran. And the president, or one of the deans of Columbia University, introduced him in an excoriating and deeply derogatory frame, which was very interesting. It was a televised presentation, and people were booing, and Ahmadinejad had to have an interpreter, and it was it's always fascinating to see someone present who's the antithesis of the values that the leaders of the university that's in opposition to them. So I'm really glad you read that. We're in the Q&A period, and I'd love to posit some questions from our audience to you, if that's all right.
please, yes.
Okay, and we're almost at the top of the hour, so if you all, I don't know if, Lauren, if you mind sticking around just a few more minutes, maybe 5 extra minutes. It's okay, everyone. We're recording this, so you can always come back to it and hear this later with the link that you used to access the event. And then I'll also have this lightly edited just at the beginning and the end of the intros, and it'll be available on our YouTube page for Malaprops as well. Let me get to a question from the audience. Lauren, you alluded to the rise of Reagan and have also mentioned Gingrich. Is there a direct correlation to YAF, as if it serves as a feeder organizations for other conservative organizations?
Yes, for several conservative organizations. So some of the alum from YAF will eventually go on to found what we know today as CPAC. And CPAC is actually where I met some of these people to interview them. I attended CPAC in 2018, which was when, or maybe 2019, but Trump was headlining that year. So that was interesting. Yeah, but many YAF alumni stay on, or they graduate out of YAF, because technically after you're 30 years old, you're not supposed to be a member, and they join CPAC, or they had joined the American Conservative Union, the ACU, and several other organizations. So yeah, a feeder group is definitely a good way to refer to YAF.
Another question from Elizabeth is, did you find any or discover any conservatives active on campus in the 1960s who today or later became more left or progressive? And I ask because I sometimes hear of movement in the opposite direction. For example, some of the neocons.
Yeah. That's the horseshoe, or is it a circle, that we were talking about earlier. Yeah, there's so many examples. Actual students, yes, David Horowitz is probably the best example. So he was a student in the 60s. He was part of the New Left and is now extremely conservative. But if you can go back further into the 30s, some of the best examples include people like Whittaker Chambers, Marvin Liebman. These are bigger names on the right, especially in anti-communism circles.
And then we have a question from Kirk. Have there been other conservative student movements in the history of American universities, for example, during the first Red Scare, during World War I, for example?
Yeah, that kind of goes back to the conversation we had earlier, and I don't know. YAF wasn't there yet, and ISI wasn't created yet, but I'm sure there may have been like some America First student organization in the wars. But I don't know. I don't have a good answer for you, and that's something I'd like to research. And anyone out here who's also interested in that, I hope you research it as well. Let me know what you find.
That book we talked about for just a moment a little earlier, A Conspiratorial Life, about Robert Welch, really gets into that. It's like your book and that book are very different, but you're tackling the subject and explaining things in such a nuanced way. I really appreciate it. And you take the subject of conservatism seriously, because sometimes I find that when we're hearing critique from the left, it's dismissive or condescending. It doesn't try to understand. It will only seek to deride. And so for you to tackle the subject and say, okay, I'm talking to the people, here's what they say, here are the contradictions, here's what doesn't line up with the archives or other people I interviewed. That's the role of the historian, I would say, is to find a way to take that seriously and say there's something of value here to understand, and readers can make up their mind, but you did too, of course. So what's next for you, Lauren? If you feel like talking about it for just a moment, where are you headed next?
There are so many things in the pipeline. I would really like to pick up where this book leaves off and see what YAF is up to in the 80s and the 90s. Though I think I'm probably going to pursue an even bigger project than that. I would like to do book number 2 on just like a history of American higher education, perhaps since the 60s, maybe even a little bit earlier, but we were talking off camera before the recording. I teach the history of American higher ed at the University of New Orleans. So this is a class that I've developed the curriculum for, and I feel like I already have sources for, and the project is almost laid out for me. And there are histories of American higher ed that exist, but they really leave out Native and tribal colleges. They really leave out athletics. So much important American college culture, I think, is withheld from the studies that exist right now too. So I think that might be my next project.
Well, Lauren, it's been so enlightening to talk with you. I've learned so much. It's broadened our understanding of higher education, that it's not a monolith, that there are currents and there's turbulence. And I want to thank you so much for your contribution to the work on that time period, to our understanding of the history of the late 60s and the 70s and higher education in this country. It's been a pleasure to speak with you, and thank you for being on this event with Malaprops.
Yes, it's so mutual. I appreciate it. I appreciate Malaprops, and of course, Elizabeth and all the reps here from UNC. Y'all mean the world to me. Thank you. Thank you, listeners, too, for spending an hour with us today.
Thank you all. Good night, everyone.